In 1772, just before the American Revolution, an English judge astounded the world in a case involving slavery. He ruled that since his country had no laws regarding the practice in England, a slave brought to England from the British North American colonies had to be set free once he set foot on English soil. The Somerset decision, named after the liberated slave in question, energized the abolitionist movement on both sides of the Atlantic, and it horrified slaveholders in the colonies, some of whom, ironically, became more sympathetic to the revolution after the ruling. But what is less well known about the Somerset case is that it offered radical implications for how a society should make choices about big questions like slavery versus freedom. The judge offered conclusions about slavery that paralleled ideas about natural law. They even implied that if England had laws permitting slavery, they would not measure up to deeply rooted concepts about how society should justly order itself. Where did this judge get these ideas? Who invented them? Why should we care about them? Stay with me as I do a philosophical dive into the Somerset case. In May of 1772, the case of James Somerset came before a court presided over by the Earl of Mansfield, aka Lord Mansfield of the King's Bench. Somerset was a slave purchased in Boston and taken to England by his owner. And yeah, I did these drawings, so you know who to blame. Charles Stuart, the man who both bought and brought Somerset, had some business in England. From what I've read, Stuart had Somerset dress up a little fancy to make him look like his personal assistant, that sort of thing. But Somerset had other ideas besides doing his master's bidding. He escaped and he joined a church full of abolitionists who baptized him and adopted him as their godson. Then they hired some lawyers and took his supposed owner to court, demanding his freedom. By then, the situation was pretty serious. His master planned to ship Somerset to Jamaica to be sold yet again. So the case went on and on like these sort of cases do, but in late June of that year, Lord Mansfield issued his decision about the controversy. Bringing a slave to England and then shipping him off for resale represented a, quote, high act of dominion that, quote, must be recognized by the laws of the country where it is used. Since there were no such laws in England, Charles Stuart could not exercise them, and therefore James Somerset must be freed. But Lord Mansfield went further. In his decision, he pretty much cut open a can of whoop-ass on slavery itself. He said, and I quote, "The state of slavery is of such a nature that it is incapable of being introduced on any reason, moral or political, but only positive law which preserves its force long after the reasons, occasion, and time itself from whence it was created is erased from memory. It is so odious that nothing can be suffered to support it but positive law." What does that mean? In other words, the only thing slavery can depend on to justify its continued existence are bad, outdated laws that should have been dumped centuries and centuries ago. But let's rewind to the beginning of that remarkable statement. The state of slavery is of such a nature. Where did Mansfield get the idea that there's a nature to slavery? If he thought that, then we can assume that he thought that there was a nature to freedom. Where did he get those ideas? Well, we could go all the way back to the philosopher Aristotle, who taught that there were intrinsic ideas about right and wrong. But about a century before the Somerset case, a philosopher named John Locke published an essay called The Second Treatise of Government, and the essay argued, that as society becomes more complicated, people give decision-making authority to civil governments, but those governments must found their decisions on, quote, the law of nature. Following this line of thought, about 20 years before Somerset, the famous English judge Sir William Blackstone declared that slavery, quote, is repugnant to reason and the principles of natural law that such a state should subsist anywhere. It is laid down, Blackstone prophetically insisted, that a, quote, slave or Negro, the instant he lands in England, becomes a freeman. That is, the law will protect him in the enjoyment of his person and his property. In other words, it's a natural law that everybody gets to enjoy autonomy over themselves and their possessions. A century after Blackstone's declaration, a politician from Illinois extended that idea. Slavery violated natural law, Abraham Lincoln argued, because it deprived people of the fruits of their labor. And a century after Lincoln, a minister named Martin Luther King Jr. warned that Jim Crow segregation violated natural law as well. Quote, any law that uplifts human personality is just, King explained. Any law that degrades human personality is unjust. All segregation statutes are unjust because segregation distorts the soul and damages the personality. The Somerset decision echoes through history not only because it freed a slave, but because it warned 18th century England and us that our human-made laws can only succeed to the extent that they coexist with deeply rooted ideas about freedom and justice. And that is why Somerset is a case for the ages, to be remembered and studied for all time.